And welcome to the Commissioner and all of her team. Just very quickly, first of all, Commissioner, you might be able to explain to me your own involvement maybe with the Garda College going back historically, and maybe different roles you would have played, other supervisory roles in the past. Can you just very quickly maybe give us that information first, if indeed there was any?
Just set a context for your time. Yeah. Obviously you went there yourself, but after that, had you any role in it before becoming Commissioner?
Well, obviously, as you say, Chair, yes, I was there as a recruit myself for 6 months in 1981, and in 2000, on promotion to the rank of Superintendent, I would have spent a period of time in the Garda College in charge of specialist training, which meant detective training, firearms training and other specialist training.
And had you any role in the past in relation to human resources that would have had any oversight for the Garda College? I
would have been in human resources as an Assistant Commissioner from October 2008 until roughly around April 2009.
And would that have involved having any oversight role in relation to the Garda Training College?
Yes, it would have come within my area of responsibility.
It would have?
In that 6 months, yes.
For that time period, okay. So you've obviously read the report, the internal audit report, Commissioner, and yes. You said yourself, you used the word unacceptable. So on page 3 of the report, this is the executive summary, it says that the GIAS, which is the internal audit, can provide no assurance that the internal management and control systems in place to manage the finances at the Garda College are adequate, that no assurance that the financial controls at the Garda College are compliant with public financial procedures, and no assurance that the financial controls at the Garda College are compliant with the Garda Finance Code. Limited assurance then in other areas as well. Is it more than unacceptable that of all organisations on Garda Síochána that the corporate body that is on Garda Síochána is not able to provide an assurance to auditors, or that the auditors themselves are not able to provide an assurance to the public that the organisation is in compliance with public financial procedures, Garda finance codes, and just proper good practice, good financial controls? Like, is it more than unacceptable in your view?
Well, as I said in my opening statement, Deputy, it is absolutely unacceptable. Again, I think the complexity of these issues have been quite rightly highlighted in the internal audit report. And these issues have their genesis going way back to the 1980s during the Walsh report. There were practices that evolved over time. I think what's important in the context, and I can get either Mr Kelly or Mr Cullinane to speak to the issues, because what's important is that we're talking about...
I might just stick with yourself first, Commissioner. If I need their assistance, I will ask for it. I just want to get your view first.
We're talking about a proportion of the vote, to certainly the assurances that are there around what I would call the normal practices in the college. There are reasonable assurances which are highlighted in point number 4 on page 3 of the audit report. However, it is absolutely unacceptable that no assurances can be provided in relation to the remaining portion. As I say, they are practices that evolved over a period of time, over a period of over 4 decades. Certainly not in line with public financial management procedures that are in existence today, and most certainly not in line with corporate governance standards as they exist.
And would it be fair to say as well, on reading the report, and I would have read the report several times myself, that there was a litany of failures, that there were sloppy practices, maladministration, and mistakes made right across the board? Would that be a fair assessment?
I think what we have to be mindful of is an interim audit report, and the work of Mr Kelly and his team continues. So what has been found at the moment is a combination of irregularities, financial irregularities, practices, as I say, that aren't acceptable by standards today and indeed standards in the past, but practices that evolved over time. So I think...
I'm just trying to establish whether we can get agreement before I proceed. So when I say that there was failures, you accepted there's failures. I use the word sloppy practice. If you want to use a different word, by all means, but my view was that there was sloppy practices, and then maladministration, and completely unacceptable financial controls in place. I'm just asking, would that be a fair assessment of a layperson's observation if they were to read the internal audit report?
I think, bearing in mind it's an internal audit report, a lot of the records aren't available, and to be fair to the audit team, in the time that was allocated for doing the audit, it's very difficult to find records going back over 40 years. And I think that there was extensive work done in an attempt to identify where those records were and to identify what the exact issues are. But I absolutely agree, they're unacceptable standards.
I prefer if you answer the question that was put, Commissioner, because I didn't ask about records that we're not aware of or we haven't seen. I'm asking you to comment on records that the internal audit did have. So on the records that they did have, they then published their report. And in publishing their report, what I'm putting to you is that there was a litany of failures, sloppy practice and maladministration. So all I'm looking for at the start is, can we just accept that as a starting point, that that's the case?
Well, we have accepted, Deputy, and I've said it in my opening statement, is that the practices were unacceptable and they remain unacceptable. They were unacceptable at the time, and we are putting in place procedures to regularise them and to make sure they are correct.
And we'll get to that later. And what I'm interested here is the relationship between the corporate body that is on Garda Síochána and good practice. And an awful lot has been made in recent times, as you know, Commissioner, and I'm sure you read the newspapers and look at current affairs programmes about the culture in Garda Síochána. And there is a perception, and you may not agree with it, but there is a perception that when there is wrongdoing, when there's failures, when there's sloppy practice, that the modus operandi or the instinct of the corporate body that is on Garda Síochána is to close ranks, defend wrongdoing, ignore issues, frustrate the work of people or entities within the force that want to actually do the right thing. That's what I'm putting to you, is a perception that is out there. So can you first of all give me your opinion on that perception, which I'm sure you were aware of?
Yes, Deputy, and it's something that I'm very aware of. On the 9th of June 2016, when we published our modernisation and renewal programme, one of the key issues we identified was the need to reform the culture of Garda Síochána. And it's actually more than just an aspiration in a document. It's something that we commenced going all the way back to 2014, when I took up the position of Interim Commissioner. And you will have seen from this, and indeed from other issues, part of the change of that culture is to make sure that we identify the issues, that we make them known publicly, and that we are prepared to open up the organisation, not just to constructive criticism, but also to have the courage and have the bravery and empower our people to actually identify where mistakes have happened, to identify where there are less than good practices and where there are weak practices, and then to make sure that we don't just identify it, but that we actually do something about it and we go about fixing it. And
we'll put that to the test now, Commissioner, in relation to whether or not issues were ignored and whether or not the work of people who wanted to bring these issues to the attention of the appropriate individuals, whether they were frustrated or not. Okay, so I want to put that to the test and examine that, because before you can reform any organisation, there has to be an acceptance that there was serious wrongdoing and that the culture isn't right, and that needs to be obviously demonstrated. So in the report itself, I'm just interested in trying to follow the time frame, because it took an awful long time for internal audit to publish a report from when this first surfaced in the organisation. So on page 12 of the internal audit report, you will see, Commissioner, that it makes reference to concerns that were first expressed about finances in the college in an incomplete and unfinished audit report, which was conducted by GIAS in 2006, a year before it was restructured. Can I ask, first of all, why was the report incomplete? Why was it unfinished? Who carried out the report? And is the person who carried out the report one of the people in the room? So if you can answer those questions first, please. Okay,
I can ask Mr. Kelly, who examined the reports, to answer those questions.
Thank you.
I moved to Garda Síochána in June 2007. So the report that I actually found on the files was a year before I started in Garda Síochána. There was an internal audit unit on Garda Síochána from 2001, I think, but it was staffed entirely by uniformed Garda staff and didn't have the requisite professional experience. I came on board as an established head of internal audit. My previous job was head of internal audit in the Department of Communications. And I re-established or restructured the unit and brought on board professional staff and train them.
So it wasn't you. So the questions I asked Mr. Kelly was why was the report incomplete? So you've said because the expertise maybe wasn't there to do it from your predecessors, but who carried it out? Who was the author of that report?
There was a team there in the past. I'm not aware who specifically was the author.
Can this committee be furnished with a copy of that report?
That was on in files when I came to the unit.
Yeah.
And concerns were raised as a result of that.
For the committee, who wrote this?
The Garda Internal Audit Unit before my time. I'm not sure who was on it.
I don't know the name, but it wasn't you. So okay. So can we have a copy of that report, please? Not today, but can the committee be furnished with a copy of that report?
Yeah.
So that report was incomplete, and that was in 2006. And then it wasn't until 2008, back to the Commissioner, that there was a report concluded by the Finance Directorate. And that it concluded, and I quote, "Our examination and review have uncovered discrepancies in compliance and exposes the organisation to substantial risk in terms of internal controls." So again, this has been highlighted. There's a report which says that there is a substantial risk to the organisation, to the corporate body. So we have to ask ourselves then, what was done? So the report goes on to say that that report in 2008 was not forwarded to the GIAS and was only discovered as part of the 2016 GIAS audit. So my question there is, who carried out the 2008 report? Is that person in the room, first of all, if you can answer that question?
No, the person isn't in the room.
And who is it?
It's a member of the Executive Director of Finance staff.
And why are they not here?
Because they're not here, but they can be made available to a future meeting of the committee.
I would have thought that somebody who was the author of one of the substantial reports would have been here, Commissioner. We asked for people who were relevant to this internal audit that they would be here.
The people who have access to the report are all here to discuss the content of the report, Deputy.
Can you then tell me, Commissioner, why the report was not forwarded on to the GIAS?
It was forwarded on to the Commissioner by the Chief Administrative Officer, and I can get my colleagues to come in here again.
It was not given. That's not the question I asked. With respect, I hope that I get answers to the questions that I put. What I asked was, why wasn't it given to the GIAS? That's the critique that is in the audit report, that it was not given to the appropriate auditing committee of Garda Síochána where it should have been given. Why was it not given?
Well, as I say, Deputy, there is the examination, the investigation that Mr. Kelly is doing as part of the internal audit is continuing. So we are endeavouring to identify the whole chain of correspondence and the decision-making around that.
Is that you don't know then, Commissioner? Well, I'm trying to establish, do you know why that report, the 2008 report, was not given to the GIAS? Who made the decision not to forward that to the appropriate body?
What we do know is that the report was forwarded to the Commissioner of the day. The Commissioner accepted the recommendations, which were forwarded by the Chief Administrative
Chair, that's not
Officer,
what I asked.
And they were sent for implementation.
I have to ask you to answer the question.
Could you repeat the question, Deputy?
For the third time, I can, Commissioner. I'm asking why the 2008 Finance Director's report that the internal audit says should have been given to the GIAS, why was it not given, and who made the decision not to give it to GIAS? If the Commissioner had it, was it his or her decision, whoever that was?
It's not clear from the correspondence that we have available to us, and I can get Mr. Kelly or Mr. Cullinane to, or indeed the Chief Administrative Officer has reviewed all of the papers, but it's not evident, is my understanding from the material that's available, as to who made that decision.
Okay. For clarity, so for interjecting, Commissioner, what you're saying is that the 2008 report, which obviously should have been forwarded on to GIAS, within your own analysis to date, you haven't been able to find out why it wasn't.
There's no doubt it should have been forwarded to the GIAS, and we haven't been able to identify the correspondence that's available to us.
We have been able to identify that it got up as far as the Commissioner?
Yes, there is a trail.
Who in Garda Síochána was responsible for making sure that it was submitted to the GIAS? In 2008.
Yeah. The Deputy Strategy and Change, the then Deputy Strategy and Change Management.
Is that person in the room?
No.
No, either. So that person was responsible.
Is that person still in the?
No.
I currently hold that position.
Currently, but you didn't at the time?
Not at all.
No.
Is that person still in the force?
No.
No.
But that person obviously then made the decision not to forward that on.
We don't know that, and it's not clear from the documentation that we have.
Well, we know they didn't. He didn't send it on, or she. So we know they didn't do it. So obviously there was a reason why it was not sent on.
But, Deputy, we don't have any evidence to say why this was not done.
Okay, well, we'll move on, because what I'm trying to get to is why it took so long from 2006 to 2016 for some conclusion to this. So we're still at 2008. We know that there was a report that was done that wasn't sent to GIS, and then in a note to the Commissioner on the 25th of April 2008, this is again still page 12 of the internal audit, if people are following that, the then Chief Administration Officer, the CAO, advised that the Audit Committee be advised at its next meeting in June of the issues that have been revealed and measures to correct them. Not to brief the Audit Committee was that person's opinion at that juncture could be regarded by the external members of the committee as a significant breach of trust. And on page 13 it goes on to say that there is no record of such a briefing in the minutes of the June 2008 meeting or any subsequent meeting of the Audit Committee. So again, this was a brief and a note that was sent to the Garda Commissioner. Again, why was that not done? Why was it not sent on to the appropriate meeting? Why was it not an item on the agenda for that meeting? Who made the decision not to send it? Who was responsible for briefing the committee? Can you answer those questions for me, Commissioner, please?
It's one of the questions that we have asked Mr Kelly to continue in his audit, to identify has anybody asked or examined the minutes of the previous audit meetings going back to 2008 to see if there is any reference or record.
Who was the Chief Administrative Officer in 2008? Is that person in the room?
No, he's not.
An awful lot of people not in the room. They should be here.
He's not still with the...
No, he's not still serving. A number of people are not. As I say, Deputy, I think it's important in context. We are talking about a period of time in which a number of people have retired and they're not here.
Deputy, continue.
And which is part of the problem, Commissioner, that it took us so long to get here. Maybe if the organisation had been swifter, we would have been able to put questions to the people who were in charge. But in any event, it wasn't done. So again, there was issues that were to be taken to the Audit Committee that were not done. The Commissioner at the time would have been briefed that not to do so would represent a significant breach of trust, and yet it wasn't done. And again, we don't know why you're saying that's been examined as well. So there is no record then of such a briefing, as it says in June 2008. Then, in his report, the CAO advises that the Director of Finance be authorised to conduct a full and comprehensive audit of all of the financial activities in the college. The report goes on to say, this is page 13, Commissioner, GIS were not informed of this proposed audit. Again, they weren't informed. So who made the decision not to inform them?
Again, Deputy, to the best of my knowledge, it's not evident from the papers that we have available to us at this time. But Mr Kelly's audit is continuing.
Okay, so again, it wasn't done. Was there any pressure exerted on any of these individuals, do you know, not to forward any of these reports or these communications or these letters to either the Audit Committee or the GIS?
Well, I have not been aware that any evidence has been identified in the course of the interim audit to suggest that that's the case.
Okay, so then the CAO also advised that the CNAG be advised, and this is again on page 13 at the bottom. As you can see, it says that the CNAG's office was informed. Was the CNAG's office informed at that time?
No record of being advised of any of those kind of concerns at that time.
And we're now up to...
We have no record of that.
We're still on 2008. We're now up to... We're now at a situation where not only the GIS were not informed, the Garda Internal Audit were not informed, the committee were not informed, and the Controller and Auditor General were not informed. And what I'm trying to do is follow a pattern here in terms of whether or not people were doing their job here, Commissioner.
It seems astonishing that there are no records that can be found in relation to the decision-making or non-decision-making processes here. Was that a culture at the time? Like there is not. I mean, obviously, this issue is out public. Everyone knows about this issue. It's quite obvious. It's been going on for some time. But the fact that consistently, in relation to the questioning of the deputy, there doesn't seem to be any records as regards decision making. Now, how does an organisation like Garda Síochána operate in that manner? Well, or if they are, they can't be found. And if they can't be found, that's even more disturbing.
Well, Chair, I can let Mr Kelly answer the question because, in fairness, he conducted the investigation. So I'm not aware, and I don't want to comment on the efforts or the extent of the searches that went on to get the documentation, and it may well be that there is documentation available which will be covered in the remainder of the ongoing audit. But
there doesn't seem to be an iota at all to date.
In relation to the questions, there is documentation in place that says that the 2008 report went to the Commissioner, and then there is correspondence in relation from the Commissioner to the Chief Administrative Officer, instructing the Chief Administrative Officer to do certain things, including to give the report to internal audit and to the Controller and Auditor General.
Was that done, Mr. Kelly?
I can't see, I didn't find any evidence that it was done.
And is that acceptable? Is that acceptable, Commissioner?
There was.
Is that acceptable, Commissioner, that was not done?
no, Deputy, as I've said from the outset, from my opening address, it's unacceptable.
And we'll find out then was that person, when we conclude whether any of these people were actually held to account, because accountability is something that seems to be lacking as well. So then it goes on in the report on page 14, there was 12 specific recommendations from the Financial Directorate, only 2 were implemented, and of the 6 points that were agreed in correspondence between the Commissioner and the CEO that we dealt with, none of them were implemented, not one. So given that that was direction that was given by the Commissioner, does that then represent a breakdown in the chain of command? Would it be reasonable then to surmise that that was the case?
So Deputy, if I can be helpful here. So in 2010, there is a record that the individual recommendations were considered. Some of the recommendations were accepted, some of them weren't. That's what the record shows. The reasons for that is not entirely clear, but that's what the record shows.
Can you turn to page 14 of the Internal Audit Report, please, Mr. Nugent? And you might read for me the second paragraph, because that doesn't seem to chime with the answer that you gave. So can you read? I'm working on the basis of the internal audit. So can you please read for me, starting from the word "however" on page 14?
Of the 12, only 2 were implemented. No, I'm not disputing this at all, Deputy.
Well, just read it for me first, please.
Apologies.
Yep.
However, of the 12 specific recommendations from the Finance Directorate report 2008, only 2 were implemented. Of the 6 points agreed in correspondence between the Commissioner and the Chief Administrative Office, none were implemented.
Now, that's the point. So was there a breakdown in the chain of command if that's the case? Is it reasonable to surmise that that was the case? A reluctant to change, a reluctance to accept that we need to make improvements, carry out changes. Does it suggest any of that to you?
What the record showed to me was that the recommendations were not accepted in some instances. So in other words, what I'm saying is that and this, it is not acceptable. I agree with you, Deputy. What I'm saying, though, is that the 12 recommendations are looked at. There were questions asked about some of the recommendations, and there were the 2 that are referenced there, that were implemented.
Okay, and then it goes on, because unfortunately for all of us it gets worse. On page 14, on the 2nd of March 2011, the GIS reported to the Garda Commissioner in relation to financial controls in 2010. That's on page 14 of the report. It stated that GIS can provide no assurance in regard to financial controls. GIS sought to conduct an audit at the financial controls, but were told that there was work being done by the Finance Directorate. Because of that, it removed a paragraph then from its own report. But it then sought several times access to this report from the Finance Directorate, and it says, despite requests for access to this report, GIS were told it was still in draft, even though it had been given to college management. So again, there seemed to be an ongoing attempt to frustrate the work of the GIS. They were seeking this draft report and they could not get it. Is that your understanding of what happened, Commissioner?
That is what is written in the report, Deputy, yes.
And the finance, the finance director, then, like, who is that? A person, or is that an entity, or what is it? Is there?
It's a section within Garda Síochána.
And is there a head of that?
Yes, there is.
And the person that was head at that time, is that person in the room?
Yes, they are.
Oh, who is that?
Mr. Cullinane.
Can you answer that then, please, Mr. Cullinane?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, if you're, you might turn then to page 14 of the report.
Yeah.
You can see then that the two paragraphs there where it says GIS can provide no assurance in regard to the financial controls in place. It talks about serious issues of concern. At that stage in 2008, we sought to conduct an audit at the financial controls in the Garda College, but were informed that the finance directors were updating the financial systems in the college and advised that we wait the outcome of this. It goes on the last line of that. We have sought access to this report on several occasions since, but have been told it is still in draft. A version of the report has, however, been provided to management in the college. So they saw that draft several times and never got it. Did you make that decision not to give them that draft?
No, it's normal practice when we're drafting a report that would go to the management in the college so that they can comment upon the report that would have been written, so that to ensure the accuracy of the report and in terms of the progress that they were making on the recommendations included in the report of 2008.
And that's fine, but if internal audit were looking for a copy of the report as well, what was wrong with giving them a copy of the draft report? You would have been aware, I'm sure, that these issues were going back to 2006. So I would imagine that the GIAS were anxious to do their job. They sought a copy of the report. What I'm asking you is, did you make a decision, for whatever reason, not to give that draft report to the GIS when they requested it?
No, I didn't make that decision. I report up the line to the Chief Administrative Officer.
So who made the decision?
I'm not aware of who made the decision not to give the copies of
the report. You don't know who made the decision? So there seems to be a very sloppy chain of command here, which is very worrying given that it's on Garda Síochána. I asked who was the head of the finance director. I was told you were.
Yes.
Yes. So somebody else up the chain of command. Maybe you might be able to help me, Commissioner.
Yes, Deputy. So the Director of Finance, Mr Cullinane, reports to the Chief Administrative Officer, who was at that stage another person, but now is occupied by Mr Nugent.
When did that person leave?
From memory, 2010, I would think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think, Deputy, on page 15 of the report, you will see that on the 4th of March 2011, the Chief Administrative Officer, so the report was actually, the report from the Executive Director of Finance forwarded to the Head of Internal Audit Unit on the 4th of March 2011.
Yes, this was after that time. I want to move on because we'll at the very end we can see clarification as much as we can on these questions. On the 6th of July 2015, the Executive Director of Human Resources and People Development delivered a report to the CEO, which is entitled Summary of Issues Arising from the Reports and Discussions Held at the Garda College. And the purpose of this report, I understand it, was to prepare the CEO so that that person could brief the Garda Audit Committee. Who was the Executive Director at the time?
Mr Barrett.
Mr Barrett. And the report was commissioned, or it was done so that the Garda Audit Committee could be briefed. Was the Garda Audit Committee briefed, Mr Barrett?
No, I learned at the end of the month that it hadn't been. The intention was that it would be briefed at its meeting on the 15th of July.
Was it briefed?
No, I understand that it wasn't on that occasion.
And who made the decision not to brief?
I don't know, but my...
Does anybody in the room know who made the decision not to brief?
My report was given to my line manager, Cyril Dunn, who is a member of that committee and who had expressed to me his intention to brief the committee.
Is Mr Dunn in the room?
No, Deputy.
But Mr Dunn, was he the person then that would have made the decision not to give this?
I can only assume so.
And
just to confirm clarity, you did the report, you gave it to the Chief Administration Officer to give to the Audit Committee?
He had commissioned it on the basis that the meeting was coming up, and what he wanted to do was synthesise the reports of 2008 and 2010 and have the issues broken out.
And I want to say then, and I'll just have questions around breaches in law, which I'll deal with very quickly, but the last issue in relation to this then is, it wasn't just that meeting, it was September again, that it was raised only under order of business, which is extraordinary.
The matter wasn't brought to the July meeting. That was a decision that Mr Dunn made at the time. It was a significant report. There was lots in it. I don't know why he didn't bring it to that committee.
I'm at the 30th of September meeting.
But he did bring it to the 30th of September. And it wasn't just for mention. There was a significant amount of detail given to the committee on that date.
I'm reading from the internal audit itself, where it says that it was mentioned under any other business and that copies of the report were not circulated to the committee members. Are you seriously telling me given that this was a serious report, that merited being raised under any other business? Is that what you're telling me?
I'm not, Mr. Scott. What I can tell you is that I'm aware that it received a lot of time at that meeting.
Do you not see on page 16, can you see on where it says, at the Audit Committee meeting on the 30th of September, the Chief Administrator Officer gave an oral account of some of the issues under any other business. The report was not circulated to the committee.
Yeah, the report wasn't circulated, that's correct. But there was a detailed oral account given.
Why wasn't it circulated?
I can't answer that.
Would that be normal? Again, it's just, there's a pattern here, sorry, but just let me for a second. There's a pattern here of no documentation, no minutes, no notes. It's lucky that it was brought up under AOB. We should be thankful.
Chair, perhaps I can be helpful there. So this matter was brought to my attention on the 30th of July. And immediately what was evident from the correspondence I received from the Deputy Commissioner Cullinane on my left, and this matter was brought to 2015.
Yep.
And what was evident was that it required a lot of work to be done to actually identify what the issues were. And immediately there was a group set up, chaired by the then Chief Administrative Officer, including representatives from the Department of Justice, to identify what the issues were and to be able to get a complete picture of what actually we were dealing with here and to address some of the issues in which we're now trying to address here also. And that group was subsequently, on the retirement of the Chief Administrative Officer, was taken over on an interim basis by the Deputy Commissioner and then subsequently by the Chief Administrative Officer. So there was a lot of work going on at that time.
It just seems extraordinary here that the pattern has continued, that a report like this, as significant as this, was not circulated.
To move on to the breaches in law very quickly, but before I do, just to say, Cathaoirleach, that I think what we need are copies of all of the reports, copies of
that report that Mr.
So I'm just going to finish first of all, not just reports, Cathaoirleach, but also any correspondence between the Commissioner and between all of the different individuals who are cited here, where there was exchange of papers and reports, minutes of meetings that took place. Mr. Cullinane was talking about that there was an extensive discussion at the board meeting that committee meeting.
I wasn't there, Mr. Cullinane, but from reading the minutes it would appear that there was an extensive discussion.
Well, and we need all of those minutes, we need correspondence, we need copies of the reports.
This report in 2015 that Mr. Barrett put together, have we got a copy of that here?
I have copies, certainly, if you want a copy.
Can you circulate them?
Surely.
Get them to the secretary. Yeah. Or the rep there. Yeah, I think it would be helpful.
I just want to, the last issue I want to raise is breaches in law, because I'm sure, Commissioner, you'll accept that legislation is put in place for people to follow, for people to implement, for people to abide by. And any breach in legislation is essentially a breach in law, isn't it? If you breach legislation, if you don't follow legislation, it's potentially a breach in law. Potentially, yeah.
Yes.
So page 4 of the report, it says that the issues identified in this report are serious and present considerable risk to the organisation and should be dealt with in a transparent manner. On page 6, it says that Garda HRM would have to remind staff who are directors of Garda College Sports Company Limited of their legal obligations and provide appropriate legal support to help them retrospectively report to SIPO.
No, we don't have it.
Okay.
Sorry, Commissioner, you'll see that it says that basically members of the superintendents and possibly a chief superintendent and others who had legal responsibilities in relation to SIPO, that they failed to make declarations that need to be made. Isn't that correct?
That's what the report says.
That's what the report says, yes. And would that represent a breach in law?
Well, what I've said in my opening address is we have, furthermore to the audit been conducted and continuing by Mr. Kelly, we also have an Assistant Commissioner who is examining the content of the interim audit report to identify if there are any further matters required.
Just very quickly, on page 17, on Garda Síochána did not have the authority to enter into an arrangement in terms of the Dromod Farm, because this was in contravention of section 29.3 of the Garda Síochána Act, which prohibits on Garda Síochána from entering into contracts relating to land. That money raised was to be transferred to the OPW. Again, page 20, that section 29.3 of the Garda Síochána Act 2005 prohibits Gardaí from being involved in land contracts. That the legal standing of the Garda College management as directors is questionable. Page 21 of the report, the Garda members, including superintendents, didn't make declarations that they should have made. Again, there's a litany here of breaches potentially in law. So my final question to you is this, Commissioner. This report is very serious. You have accepted that. It seems to me that there was an attempt by people within the Garda College to frustrate the work of the GIS. That's how I see it, because it took an awful long time from 2006. Reports which should have been given, papers, documents which should have been given to internal audit were not given. And then we have breaches in law, and I haven't even got to any of the issues in relation to any of the bank accounts, the laundry account, the bar account, the restaurant account. Other members will go through all of that in terms of how all of the money was spent from let's just say, ways in which it shouldn't have been spent. There was several breaches in legislation documented in this internal audit. So how are you satisfied as Garda Commissioner that the law was not broke by members of the force here in terms of any of these issues? How can you be certain there was no criminal wrongdoing?
Well, Deputy, what I have said is an Assistant Commissioner, as well as the ongoing audit that's been conducted by Mr Kelly, an Assistant Commissioner is looking at the content of the audit report and what has been found to date. I think, again, what is evident, and I think there's a couple of things that need clarity. So, for example, the company that we're talking about was actually established in 1993. We need to, and to be fair to Mr Kelly and the team, they did not have the time to go back to 1993 to look and see what led to the establishment of that company, who was aware of the establishment of that company, and what the legislation that was in place at the time is a different form of legislation. That's one thing.
First become aware of that company? In
2015.
First?
Yes. Okay. And as part of this ongoing work that Mr Kelly and the Chief Administrative Officer were doing. Secondly, you know, there is a perception that Garda Síochána bought a farm. The fact is that the land that was acquired, so the requirement by Garda Síochána was for land that needed to be acquired to develop a tactical training facility within the environment of Templemore because of the development of Garda Síochána.
The point I was making was that the internal audit cites breaches in legislation time and time again. I wasn't looking for excuses around whether people own farms or not. What I'm saying is that this is the report that I'm working from. This report, as I've cited, Commissioner, over and over again, documents potentially several breaches in different acts by members of Garda Síochána. So what I'm saying is, who examines that? Who investigates that? Who makes sure that there is no, or was no, criminal wrongdoing by anyone in Garda Síochána in respect of any potential breaches in law? Whose job is it to make sure that is done?
Deputy, just to assist the committee, I think it's important that we are clear. The land that was acquired on behalf of Garda Síochána was acquired by the OPW. As I've said in the opening remarks on what the actions we were taking, we were working with the OPW to look at that and to establish exactly how that happened. We're also looking at, with the OPW...
You can rent for something you didn't own.
Well, Deputy, we have to be very clear. There are, even since the audit report, the interim audit report, was finalised, other documentation has been found which would indicate that the initial rents actually were given to the OPW by the leaseholders.
The report, with respect, says that 126,000, if I'm reading that correct, maybe the controller can confirm this, that 126,000 needs to be transferred from the Garda Síochána vote to the OPW because the money was collected. And we now know that a lot of that money was spent on things like donations and gifts to members of Garda Síochána. So essentially what's happening here is the taxpayer is footing the bill. The taxpayer has to pay the 126,000. The money will be given from the Garda vote to the OPW, but a lot of that money was spent on insurance and gifts and bars and restaurants and all sorts of things. And it's the taxpayer again who's going to foot the bill. Isn't that what happened here? So the money, a lot of that money is actually spent. It's gone. And if the money is transferred to from the vote of Garda Síochána, it will be again the taxpayer footing the bill, and the people who spent the money, well, we don't get it back from them. Is that acceptable? Is that what's happening here?
As I said in the opening address, we are continuing to work to implement the recommendations, including making sure, as the Chief Administrative Officer has outlined, making sure that we regularise the accounts and the accounting practices that are there, and there is no question that the money will be transferred to the OPW.
Thank you, Deputy.